Charles Spencer and his supporters can argue, perhaps, that to be a Roundhead was to be a defender of freedom, the fundamental rights of man, and popular sovereignty. He can, and he did, point to the climatic years of the late 1640s, which saw the Roundheads challenge, defeat, and of course ultimately execute Charles I, the absolutist tyrant, as they would have it. As such, I have problems because we've got a nice and a nasty Charles, or, you know, two Charleses. So Charles Spencer, of course, can then argue that with the Civil War, we see the end of what he's described as ridiculous concepts of medieval kingship and the birth of the constitutional rule that we take for granted today. Now, I want to sort of take apart some of those arguments, or at least challenge them a little bit. I will argue that Charles Spencer's support for the Roundheads, and indeed his claims for their achievement, misrepresents their cause as it developed during and immediately after the Civil War. I will point to the reality of life under the Roundheads during the 1650s and ask whether this was the kind of country you would have wanted to have lived in. We will look at the actions of the archetypal and much praised by Charles Spencer Roundhead, Oliver Cromwell. Has his achievement been overstated? Should the Roundheads get the plaudits that Charles claims they deserve? I will also question how decisive and significant the Civil War actually was in the journey towards constitutional rule. The victory of the Roundheads was, after all, emphatically reversed with the restoration of Charles II in 1660, and one only needs to look, for example, to the 1680s, when the Crown humbled Parliament to argue that the Roundheads did not inevitably set a course towards constitutional monarchy. We also need to move beyond the stereotypical images of Roundheads and Cavaliers. As Jonathan said, they were born as terms of polemic and abuse. But in deciding your position today in this debate, it's important to realise that this is not simply a choice between a monarchy or republic. When we think of Roundheads and Cavaliers, we're thinking more than that. We're thinking about an attitude to life, a lifestyle, a temperament, an ideal, and it crosses class lines. Pleasure, passion, joie de vivre, or self-control, self-denial, and a dour lack of humour. Such is the stark choice. Now, in reality, of course, we need both. But it's what you would prefer to be made of the most, if I can put it like that this debate is about. But first, let us deal with the 17th century context. What was it to be a Roundhead or a Cavalier? Can we look back and make a choice? Well, it's not an easy question. Everybody has an impression and mental image of the Cavaliers, gorgeously dressed supporters of Charles I. And of course, we have Van Dyck to thank for much of that. The popular impression has much to do with a Cavalier's clothes and his Charles Spaniels, as it does with his politics. And it's long been a tendency to dismiss the Cavaliers, in the words of Sellar and Yeatman in their 1066 and all that, as wrong but romantic, as the unthinking, unyielding defenders of an absolutist monarch in the face of those who asserted the supremacy of Parliament. But actually, and this is a crucial point that I would first take issue with nice Charles here, was that actually the terms are much more complicated. It's not simply about for and against divine right monarchy. Matters of religion, of politics, geography, gender, family, self-interest, all of these played a part in people's decisions about which sides to take in the Civil War. Broadly speaking, yes, those who fought for the king were high Anglicans and Catholics, but there were also some moderate Puritans. There were men and women, and they were not simply defenders of a moribund status quo. Royalism was full of vitality, cultural vibrancy, and intellectual creativity. Perhaps the archetypal Cavalier was the king's nephew, Prince Rupert, who was put in charge of the cavalry. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and a brilliant leader. He's often remembered today as little more than being an impulsive cavalryman, brightly clad and galloping at the head of the royalist forces. But actually, that does very scarce justice to the whole of the man. When his participation in the Civil War ended, Rupert was only 26 years old and went on to have an active life as a soldier, a sportsman, a scientist and artist. Indeed, our very own Charles Spencer has written an excellent book on Prince Rupert, the last Cavalier, and he himself has acknowledged Prince Rupert's appeal. In this fantastic book of Charles, the prince is portrayed as impetuous and imperious, but also courageous and industrious. A man interested not only in the art of war on land and on sea, but also an amateur scientist who invented new arguments and explosives, new armaments and explosives, an artist and a founding member of Charles II's Royal Society. There was more to him than his handsome looks and his spaniel, wasn't there, Charles? Another great Cavalier, of course, was William Cavendish, Marquess and later Duke of Newcastle. In many cases, he perfectly matches the kind of stereotypical image of the Cavaliers. But again, there's more to him than this. Beyond his enthusiasm for fencing and horse riding, he was an important patron of the arts, in particular Ben Jonson. He wrote verse and prose himself, and together with his brother, he was at the forefront of the new philosophy in England, promoting theoretical research, practical experiments in optics, mathematics, mechanics. And when he was in exile, he continued his philosophical and scientific researches, drawing Descartes and Hobbes into his circle. He patronised many of the leading exponents in the fields of literature, art, music and science, and he must be acknowledged for this. He also married whilst he was in exile, and his wife, who better known as Margaret Cavendish, was also a figure much to be recommended. She was a feminist in many ways, ahead of her time, the first woman in Britain to publish books in her own name, including a biography of her husband. So I think we can agree that we can dismiss the Cavalier stereotype of style over substance. I could go on. I could point to William Davenant. I could point to Edward Hyde, who wrote a history of the English. I could go on. Not to least to mention, of course, Cavalier poets who wrote about sensual love and the importance of enjoying life and living in the moment. So from this distance, it's perhaps impossible to say where you would have been in the 17th century, a Cavalier or a Roundhead. So many factors were at stake. And in fact, again, to add a slightly more nuanced position to the debate, many people were initially reluctant to commit themselves to one side or another. People saw themselves as being both for the king and for Parliament, and were then only as the war developed forced to take sides. And what of the Roundheads? Did they prove to be the champions of popular sovereignty and liberty? Would you have liked to live under Roundhead rule? The Roundheads were against the monarchy and in support of Parliament. We know that. But actually what's central to their belief was religion, the centrality of religion. And we need to put that very much at the heart of our debate. And when we're talking about the Roundheads here, we're not simply talking about a desire for simple worship in the face of Charles' more ornate worship and equal access to the scriptures. We're actually talking about their core belief being predestination, in the divine election for salvation of a chosen few. And it was this, in fact, that galvanized their opposition to church and king. Far from the Puritans being egalitarians or proto-democrats, this was about the most elitist worldview imaginable. Not to mention one that tended towards a strident paternalism, a knowing what's best for the unsaved and unwashed. And we also can see division in Roundhead ranks. After the establishment of the Commonwealth, the group of thinkers known as the Levellers soon clashed with the newly appointed Council of State. Key Leveller leaders were imprisoned. Moreover, many of the tens of thousands of women who fought on the side of the Roundheads were equally disappointed. When thousands signed a petition for equal rights and delivered it to Parliament, they received short shrift. They were told by Cromwell's parliamentarians to go home and wash the dishes. Pretty much words to that effect. When we're talking about Cromwell and loyalty, I think we need to think in very different terms than perhaps our nice Charles here would suggest. What resulted after the execution of the king was not the visionary Commonwealth that many held out hope for. In the end, it seemed more like a military coup than a democratic revolution. England became a religious republic, an armed camp, an occupied country in all but name, where law might easily be delivered at the point of a sword, as in the magistrate's court. Along with this massive security campaign was this drive to puritanize the land. The Church of England was destroyed. Bishops, priests, chaplains, school teachers were ordered to leave their posts. The universities were purged. All joy was removed from daily life. Christmas, for goodness sake, was to be banned. Even on a Sunday, no longer could you do horse riding or knitting. Cromwell, we need to consider very carefully. He displayed a colossal self-righteousness, a coarse intolerance and for bullying. He was no proto-democrat. He, of course, perpetuated in Ireland, not least, infamous atrocities which dominated that period. And his appalling cruelty is acknowledged right to this day. And of course, in 1653, this great champion defender of Parliament dissolved the Parliament. And in doing so, he undid, at a stroke, the entire legitimacy of the war, which he'd fought against the king's own unparliamentary principles. The Republic failed. Have I got 1 minute?
I haven't pinged yet.
Oh, I haven't pinned. Oh, good.
You've got at least 90 seconds.
Oh, brilliant. The Republic failed. In 1660, there was a widespread desire to establish the relationship between Crown and Parliament. And with the restoration of Charles II, the exploits of the parliamentarians were emphatically reversed. So much that in 1700, the poet laureate John Dryden could write, "Thy wars brought nothing about." Indeed, it might be argued that the most important effect of the regicide and Cromwell's protectorate was to induce, as one historian has described, an enduring mistrust of radical institutional change in England. If Charles I had not been executed, it might be asked, would we still have a monarchy now? But what about the terms Roundhead or Cavalier today? And this is really where the heart of tonight's debate lies. These terms survive regardless of the 17th century conflict and have come to describe different and opposing types or archetypes in British national character. And just as in the 1640s, it's not simply a question of class or money, left or right, but it's one of taste and temperament. On the one side, we have flamboyance, the love of fun, a scorn for rules, a sense of irony. On the other side, we have those marked by earnestness, discipline in life and work, an iron will to give up pleasure, always ready to be outraged or indignant, ready to wave a finger of disapproval, and not naturally given to irony. And some people might say, isn't that basically American culture? Well, in many ways, that's true. Many of the English revolutionaries were exported there at the Restoration. Cavaliers instead rely on flamboyance, connections. They rely on the big picture, big gestures, taking risks, seizing the day. They believe in self-sacrifice if the cause motivates them. They celebrate the cult of the amateur. It's about taking part, not necessarily winning. Now, in their commitment to hard work and moral probity, of course, the Roundheads are to be admired. They've made a considerable contribution to Britain today. They've set up bureaucracy and systems with a bowler-hatted professionalism. But are we now not increasingly aware of the dangers and the downside of Roundhead Britain? An encroaching sense of the nanny state, of being told what we can and cannot do. There's growing resistance to the intrusion of the state to health and safety regulations, big brother surveillance cameras in our life. Yes, we've achieved, thank you, Roundheads, but at what cost? Society is now suffering from a burnout, an inability to get off life's treadmill, a sense that there's more to life than work, but not knowing how to change. We all want a bit more Cavalier influence in our lives. We all want more food, more good company, and an appreciation of the better things. We can also, I think, see Cavalier and Roundhead types among politicians. I'm sure we recognise Roundhead ones, rather humorless, puritanical, dour, more focused on winning and being more politically correct than inciting the passions. You know the type of people. It doesn't make you want to stay watching Question Time. They are the politicians who conform to professional party machines, who follow the diktats of party officials or spin doctors. Cavalier politicians, on the other hand, stand out for their irreverence, their passions, their determination not to be politically correct. One might herald Tony Benn as a figure. One might even point to Boris Johnson. You don't have to agree with his politics to acknowledge his flamboyance and his ability to liven up a debate. Surely Winston Churchill, with his cigar-smoking love of rogues, his relentless passion, his charm and wit, heralded by many as the greatest Britons, was the ultimate Cavalier. Nowadays, surely we want more Cavalier politicians. There's too many clones, too many risk-averse carbon copy MPs who have few core convictions for which they are prepared to live and die for. Political disaffection and disengagement is surely a consequence. Oh, what Ed Miliband would do for some Cavalier charisma. And so, to return to the motion, ladies and gentlemen, life is short, life is precious, we should celebrate it and enjoy its riches and live in the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, do I look like a Roundhead? I urge you to reject the motion and support me in saying I would rather be a Cavalier than a Roundhead.